Thank you everybody for coming to the final of our 2023 historic speaker series looking at the creative arts of all unique people groups which converged at this site in the 1830s. Those people groups included indigenous people who had been using the ancient trail between the Fox and Wisconsin rivers for generations. It included people of French ancestry. It included people from newly arriving other European ancestry. It included African Americans coming with the military. It included a lot of different people groups that were coming at a time of a lot of turbulence in Wisconsin's past. But if you look through that turbulence, you also see the creative arts that they're also bringing with them, which are being continued in spite of, perhaps also because of, these times of trauma. And so this season we've, their speaker series, we've looked at a few different angles of the creative arts here at Portage. We've looked at indigenous arts, we've looked at African American arts of song and storytelling. Tonight we're looking at a kind of different aspect of creative arts. A lot of creative arts are functional. Anytime you build a structure, you're putting both practical knowledge into designing that structure, but you're also putting, whether you think of it or not, some creative arts into it, because architecture is part of, well within the realm of creative arts. And so tonight we're really excited to hear about the French architecture, which was seen throughout Wisconsin, right here at Portage, back at this time and just even earlier in Wisconsin history. We're hearing from Mary Antoine, who is a historian and author, retired from the Wisconsin Historical Society. She's also the Wisconsin representative of the French Heritage Corridor, kind of a new initiative to kind of take a deeper look at the French heritage throughout the Midwest. So we're excited to hear from you, and thanks for coming.
Thank you for asking. My interest has always been material culture, the objects that a culture made and left behind. For a number of years I worked in upstate New York, and I was very much into the Palatine German culture up there. And I was born and raised in Prairie du Chien and ended up returning there and got interested in the French Canadian culture, not only of the prairie, but also through Wisconsin and the upper Mississippi. Time period I look at, there weren't all of these political lines drawn, and people moved and traveled much more so, I think, than people realized. And so the French Canadians who came to the western Great Lakes, the upper Mississippi Valley, brought with them their culture and pretty much imbued it in the land. And then once those damn Yankees started coming, their culture sort of became very personal and very private, and in some ways disappeared. The homes they built were small, and they were made out of hewn logs, and the new residents of the prairie wanted stick-built homes that could be 2 stories high with lots of room, and so it went. And a lot of the early French Canadian structures that were in Wisconsin and the upper Mississippi have disappeared. But there are still a few of them hiding out there. And so I really started researching them and using French Canadian publications as sort of my guidelines. There's 1 or 2 books by Michel Lessart that are really, really good. And you don't have to know French to read them, because after a while you can start picking up certain words. And the French of the lower Mississippi, New Orleans, Saint Genevieve, they've done a lot of research on the homes that they have there, mainly because there's a lot more than there are up in this area. So I've sort of pulled together a lot of information and then examined the few buildings that still exist. So with that in mind, I'll tell you what I found. So the French started coming to what is now Wisconsin 350 years ago this year. Father Marquette and Louis Joliet were the first French-speaking people to venture the Fox, Wisconsin waterway all the way to the Mississippi River. And after that, other Frenchmen started coming from Quebec and Montreal. Some of the Frenchmen were military people, and some of them were looking at the source of the furs for the fur trade. And quite often the history that you hear of Wisconsin about the French is all fur trade history. But when they did come, they started building, I hate to use the word fortifications, even though they were called forts. A lot of times they were just fortified homes. But you had a fort here in the Mission, St. Francois Xavier, at what is now Green Bay, or if you would have traveled through that area, it would have been La Bay. And then there was Fort St. Nicholas down here at the mouth of the Wisconsin River, Fort Le Sueur, and you can keep on going. And there were a variety of forts. There was a fort up on Madeline Island, and of course at Michilimackinac. So the first structures were fortified log-hewn buildings. And they were there mainly because of the fur trade, because the French were coming to engage in the trade with the native nations. This was the main source for the furs, the Western Great Lakes, upper Mississippi region. But none of these fortifications were permanent. Most of them were used seasonally. The one at La Bay, they tried to do year-round, it didn't work. And then once the English gained control of this area, that was sort of the end of the French fur traders coming in, and you had the British fur traders. But some of these places where they built the fortified structures were very important because they were confluences. They were where bodies of water came together, and everybody traveled the waterway, whether you were an indigenous person, whether you were a French Canadian, whether you were French from the southern Mississippi, whether you were British Canadian. And so that's where these fortified structures were built. And in time, they become permanent European settlements. So at La Bay, you have the first permanent European settlement in what's now Wisconsin. Charles Langley came from Michilimackinac. He originally sided with the French, then he sided with the British. You know, you got to keep your economy worthwhile. And he was a fur trader. Okay, so you trade with the French. Well, the French don't have the land anymore, so you trade with the British. And he asked permission to resettle at La Bay. And so in 1767, which is the year that it's given, Charles and his family came and began the settlement at La Bay. Another place that was a great confluence was the prairie that was just north of the Wisconsin River, where it flowed into the Mississippi River. And somewhere along the way, it got the name La Prairie du Chien, which we have nicely corrupted to Prairie Sheep. Americans can't speak French. And so settlement began here in the 1770s. So both of these settlements are pre-American Revolution. So you have two permanent settlements beginning at the opposite ends of the Fox, Wisconsin waterway. There was also a settlement up in Lake Superior in the Apostle Islands, which is now called Madeline Island, but it was La Pointe. And so there was, again, permanent settlement there. And at this place where that Fox, Wisconsin River don't quite come together. So those are mainly the 4 places in what's now Wisconsin where permanent settlement was begun by French-speaking people. So they're here because of the fur trade. There's no two ways about it. Many of them marry Native American women. So it is very much a culture of exchange. The Native Americans, indigenous people, adopt some of the French culture, and the French adopt some of the native culture. So, where did these people come from that speak French? Some of them came directly from Montreal or Quebec, but most of them stopped somewhere in between. And, as I said, Charles Langlade was up at Michilimackinac, and Michilimackinac is on the mainland. It's on the lower half of Michigan, and that was begun in 1717. Again, that area is where you have 3 Great Lakes that come together. And the French built a fort at Michilimackinac. The British then took it over, and then the British moved the fort to Mackinac Island. And so the center of residency population sort of moved with the fort from Michilimackinac to Mackinac Island, although it was always called Michilimackinac, whether you were on the mainland or whether you were on the island. Michilimackinac on the mainland has now been rebuilt based upon extensive archaeology. And this is a nice early print of the shoreline on Mackinac Island. And you can see the type of homes that are there. So the majority of the people who settled at La Bay, Green Bay, came from Michilimackinac, from Canada to Michilimackinac to La Bay. And because of that, they brought with them a French tradition of land measurement, of land partitioning. So this is the earliest map of La Bay, Green Bay. You have Green Bay, you have the Fox River. And on each side of the river, to the west and to the east, the people who came to settle there selected a piece of land. It was very arbitrary. There was no deed, there was no survey, anything. It was very arbitrary. But when they did that, they settled their land as they would have along the St. Lawrence River in long lots. And so everybody had a long lot of land and facing the Fox River, because that was your main form of transportation. And when they built a home, the home was built close to the river. And then behind that would be your barns, your stables, your sheds, your outbuildings, your orchard, and also land that was farmed. And by the extension of Green Bay, they also include Kaukauna. And this is drawn in 1818 of Green Bay, so down here, which is really north, the mouth of the Fox River, Green Bay, you have Fort Howard. But it shows some of the people who settled here: Langlois, Grignon, another Grignon, Chaudin, the Law family, and this is just a small section. But again, you can see that they're in long lots and all of their buildings face the Fox River. Now, we're going to go down to the other end of the Fox-Wisconsin waterway to La Prairie du Chien. And the people who settled there came from Michilimackinac, but they also came from the Illinois country. And the Illinois country was named because of the native people who were there, the Illini. And the Illinois country was on both sides of the Mississippi River. So on the west side, you had Saint Genevieve, and then Saint Louis or St. Louis. And on the east side, you had Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Prairie du Roche. And so at Prairie du Chien, you have a blending of all French-speaking people, but two sort of little separate cultures. And that is seen on how they do land partitioning. So this map is drawn 1820, the same year that the Green Bay map is drawn by a U.S. surveyor. And again, the Mississippi River, down here is the Wisconsin River, and the land is divided, again, into those long lots. And they are all surveyed only by the frontage, and they're surveyed in arpents. A-R-P-E-N-T-S. And I've seen anywhere from 178 feet to 194 feet equaling one arpent, so take your pick. Somewhere in there. And again, this map is hard to see, but all of the names are listed on those lots, and they're either French Canadian or British Canadian. Because when the Brits, and they were mainly Scottish, they're mainly Scotsmen, came over to Quebec and Montreal, they adapted right into the culture that the French had begun. They were involved in the fur trade. They would marry either French women or Native American women or Métis. And so again, there was a blending of culture, and the Scotsmen and the Frenchmen worked together fine in the fur trade. But there's a difference with Le Prairie du Chien and Green Bay, and that difference comes because of the Illinois French. On Le Prairie du Chien is a 9-mile prairie, and part of the prairie is also an island. So this is an island and the rest of the prairie. And instead of everybody just having one long lot, some of them had these lots, which were called farm lots. And some had these lots, or these smaller ones, that were village lots. So at Le Prairie du Chien, we had 3 villages. We had the main village, which is on the island, which nowadays is called St. Ferréol Island. And then you had the upper village, and then you had a third village, the village of St. Ferréol. And this is very much from the Illinois French. If you go to, well, sort of, you don't see it anymore, but if you go to Kaskaskia, that was very much set up like this, with farm lots and village lots. So Le Prairie du Chien, you have a blending of the French-Canadian culture coming through Michilimackinac, and also the French culture coming up from the Illinois country. And when the people settled these two communities, they brought their architecture with them. Yeah, you know, so often we see these pictures of Quebec City, and they're the great big stone, you know, houses. Well, that's the city. Out in the countryside where the habitants lived, their homes were smaller, and many of them were made out of hewn logs. As Susan, my boss, is sitting here, will often tell you, people will say, "Hey, what's that log cabin?" And I go, "It's not a cabin. It's a house." And these were built to be permanent structures. They had footings, they had floor, the rooms were all finished, and the second loft floor was also finished. They were meant to be permanent structures, and a lot of them still exist up in Canada today. So French brought hewn wooden structures with them from the Canadas. The French also brought with them a little of the Caribbean influence. The French had settled Haiti, and some of the French from Haiti came to what's now New Orleans and on up to the Illinois country. And the homes there would have these porticos or porches around them, again, to mitigate the sun where you could sit, where you could still get a breeze. And as you can see, this is a French house from the Illinois country. And so you have sort of two different influences coming in to their homes. So some of the homes are called Au and Tar, which literally means post in the earth. And these you will find in the more southern part of the Mississippi River. So you would have hewn logs, and they would literally be put down into the earth, and then you would have stone supports for your floor joists and your floor. Interestingly enough, and again this shows the influence of the Illinois country in Prairie du Chien, and we have a description from James Lockwood, who came to Prairie du Chien in 1817. And he says, the houses were built by planting posts upright in the ground with grooves in them so that the sides could be filled with split timber or round poles and then plastered over with clay and whitewashed in a white earth found in the vicinity, and then covered with bark or clapboards riven from oak. So we had code and tear at Prairie du Chien. The only problem with that is, this is a southern form of architecture. In Prairie du Chien, we have rain, we have snow, it freezes, and these houses did not last very long. And they also had them up at Michilimackinac. This is a reconstruction of the Southwest Barracks, and it has 3 joined homes, like a row house. And the middle house is where Charles Langley lived before he moved to Green Bay. And again, you can see that these were built with the posts in the ground. That could be one of the reasons why Michilimackinac was abandoned for moving on to the island. So what they started to do then was put the posts and sole into a sill. So you have a rock foundation, you have a sill, the posts are placed in, and these are called maison et colombage, half-timbered houses. Germans call them Fachwerk houses. French call them maison et colombage. And then the infill between the upright posts is called boussage. And it's a mixture of earth, clay, straw, grass, anything that will bind together well. And then these all sort of change and get adapted as the years progress. They go away from the post in ground or post in sill to pièce sur pièce taillons en coulisses. So these are coulisses, the verticals. And they are notched with a groove. So when you hew these small logs, they have tenons, and you can slip one on top of another. Much better in a northern climate. And some of the pièces were small, some of them were much longer. Pièce sur pièce means literally stick on a stick. So you have stick on stick with a coulisse. And at the end of the construction of French log houses in Wisconsin, we lose the coulisses and you end up with just dovetailing. So pièce sur pièce, dovetailed human logs. And we've got examples in all 3 of the 4 communities that I mentioned. So first we'll look at La Bay. Again, lots of residences here at one time. So we have Joseph Jourdan's house that used to be on the east side of the Fox River. Joseph came to Green Bay in 1789. He was a blacksmith, and he was a very important part of the communities. Every community had to have at least one blacksmith. You would need them for your own daily living. Blacksmiths made nails, horseshoes, but they were also definitely needed in the fur trade, because part of the trade were metal tools that could break, and also they were guns. And so a good blacksmith could even repair a gun, even though he was not a gunsmith. So Joseph Jourdan had his home in La Bay, but he also would come to the Prairie du Chien for doing blacksmith works. Regrettably, his house no longer exists. But some of the items that he made still do, and they're all at the Neville Museum. He was very well known for the pipe tomahawks that he made. They are works of art. They're finely made, and quite often he would inlay the blade in this area with a half moon or a crescent moon with 3-petaled flowers, and so they were all brass inlaid. He also made utilitarian objects like that toaster and andirons and other items. So, as I said, his house is no longer there, but the things that he made are. One of the homes that still exists is Le Porlier Tank House, which now is at a Heritage Hill. But this is the way it originally sat, on the west side of the Fox River. So you can see how close to the water the homes were built. And then the outbuildings were behind it. And this house was heated with fireplaces. And these were very massive fireplaces. Quite often they would include a bake oven. Because at La Bay and at Prairie du Chien, the farmers grew grains. And the grains could be ground into flour. And then the flour baked into bread. Bread is the staff of life for a French person. And they were also needed in the fur trade. Because if you were going to winter as a fur trader, you would leave your home and you'd go up a river to winter, and there you would stay until the spring when the trade would occur. And you would bring with you sacks of biscuits, like hardtack, and also dried yellow peas. And at La Prairie du Chien, they grew not only the grains, but they also grew the peas. And so you had many homes that looked like this. And again, looking at James Lockwood, he said, Green Bay was kind of a trader's depot for the trade of the Bay, the Fox, and the upper part of the Wisconsin rivers, which were considered dependents of La Bay. And at La Bay, Lockwood found John Law and 4 or 5 grignoux. But he also observed the transitory nature of their residence. He said those traders who pretend to make Green Bay their home reside generally but a small portion of the year there, as most of them wintered in the Indian country and generally spent 2 or 3 months of the summer at Mackinac. So Green Bay was sort of a transitory community, and there were not as many homes there as there were at Prairie du Chien. So you take the tank house, you strip off all of the siding, and what do you have? You have a French Canadian pièce sur pièce en coulisse house. These are very old slides, but you can see the coulisse, and in between are the human logs. The house was literally falling apart a few years ago, and they took it all apart and put it back together again. And so you had a central house, 2 rooms with a sort of a half-second floor. And this is the side of the tank house. So again, you can see the coulisse. And so here is your floor to your second floor. And above that, you have all of this infill or bousselage, which in this case looks like it was stone. And this is where your fireplace backed against the wall. So, one of the original coulisses, and they had to make the new one to replace other ones. So again, a hewn log, and you can see that there is this channel within it, and which you would then slide the tenons for the other hewn logs. And that's what it looks like today. It's gone through Leroy family, Horlier family, and then in 1850, Nels Otto Tonk acquired it. And he's the one that stuck on these 2 wings. And then, of course, the house has been moved to Heritage Hill. Also at Heritage Hill is this little structure. It's basically 1 room. Again, it's pièce sur pièce en coulisse. It was found inside of a house on Adams Street in Green Bay. So there was this whole house built around it. And we've also found that at Prairie du Chien, where you have somewhere in the core of the house, the original house, which is a French-Canadian structure. And so this was saved. It was moved to Heritage Hill. Ignore the roof line because that's all supposition. And it's a hipped roof. And while they had hipped roofs in Quebec and Montreal, we found no examples of a hipped roof in the Western Great Lakes. They were just 2-sided roofs with gable ends. We have no idea whose house this was. No one has really done the research, but it could be figured out from whoever Longmont that originally was on the east side of the Fox River. Well, just down the river from Green Bay was the Grand Cacolin, or Cacana as we call it now, and you're all familiar with the Charles Grignon house that's there. But there was an earlier house there before that. Dominique Ducharme came from Green Bay, from Montreal, and again engaged in the fur trade, but he went down to the Grand Cacolin. That's where the falls are at Cacana. And he built a French-Canadian pièce sur pièce en coulisse house, and then he went back to Montreal, and the property passed to Augustin Grignon, and he made an addition. So this house has been expanded. And this is where Charles Grignon, who was born and raised before he built what is now known as the Greenville Mansion. House does not exist anymore. Looks pretty rough, but never judge the French-Canadian log house by its exterior. Okay? This is the carved fan that was on the fireplace mantle in that house. It's great federal, or if you're English, Adams architectural element. And this was Dominique Ducharme's shaving mirror, which he brought with him from Montreal, and obviously must have passed it on then to the Grignon family. So the homes were very well furnished. Again, they may look rough on the outside, but they were well furnished. And that's a shot of the interior of the Dominique Ducharme house prior to its demolition. And so this is what's left of the fireplace. But this all would have been plastered over, a mantle built, and again that fan from the mantle. And then that is a picture of Augustin Grignon, and he is holding a pipe tomahawk that was made by Joseph Jourdain. Okay, so now keep on going down the Fox River, up the Fox River, cross over, and down to Prairie du Chien. And there's lots of descriptions of some of the homes at the Prairie du Chien. In 1805, Zebulon Pike stopped there, and he says in the main village there are 18 dwelling houses. And across the Marais, 8 dwelling houses, and then scattered about the country are 8 more dwelling houses. And so there was quite a few there. In 1811, Nicholas Bovin says he found between 30 and 40 houses and at least 32 families. So quite a large place. And this is a watercolor. It was done in 1829. This is one of the houses scattered about the prairie, the house, and the barn. And we have descriptions of the barns that were at Green Bay, and they talk about how they were thatched with straw. And so this shows one of them. Still standing at Prairie du Chien is a Strange Powers house. Strange Powers was British. He was Canadian. He came to Prairie du Chien because of the fur trade, and this is an example of a house within a house. Within this house is a 2-room French-Canadian log house. And these are some of the walls that have been exposed. So again, you have the coulees, but instead of hewing logs, you basically have raw branches or small trunks of trees. And so this is called Pièce sur Pièce, en coulisses, pied sur pied. Basically, how does that translate? It doesn't translate. But what's really nice is it has remnants of how these walls were finished off. They were not left raw. They were plastered over. So you had a smooth white surface. And not only were they plastered, then they were whitewashed. And so you could refresh the whitewash on a regular basis. The owner of this house one day went down into the crawl space beneath the house to run his television cable from one room to another and found what he thought was a marble. Brought it up. Oh, that's a musket ball. Since then, he has dug and dug and dug Under the house, he has found trade beads, he has found pins, he has found such a variety of china that would have been used in the house. He's found rosaries. He has 2 long tables that are completely filled with things that he has found. So it's a very wealthy source of information. We're not too sure when the house was built, but we think it was there in the 1790s. This poor structure was built by the Charrier family. And again, it's an example of pièce sur pièce en coulisses. Again, 2 rooms, and in this case, the horizontals are hewn logs. And this gives you a better idea of what the side looks like. And also that it has this pitch on it for an overhanging porch, which again you find in the Illinois country. In between this area, it used to be filled with all types of clay. And it was a local clay, and in there we found grasses and seeds and such a variety of things. And, you know, we keep thinking, hey, you know, we could go back in time and try and plant whatever was filled in as the bousselage. This house still exists. It's Antoine Le Riviere house. Pierre Antoine came to Prairie du Chien from the Illinois country, and his son-in-law, Pierre Le Riviere, who came there from Green Bay, inherited the house. Now again, you never guess. It's got this horrid fake stone all the way around it. But it's got a double-pitched roof, which again is very French Canadian, found in Canada and also down in the Illinois country. This is how they are diagrammed. And inside the house, that is the roof support system. This is the support for the first pitch of the roof, and this is the support for the second pitch. And these are the walls within the house. And again, a remnant of the whitewash that used to be on there. And in the basement is the support for the fireplace. So when you're looking for these houses, sometimes you have to look underneath, up above, or in between to find what you're looking for. This house does exist. It's been completely restored. Francois Bergefique came to Prairie du Chien from Green Bay. The house originally started out as this much, and then there was an addition made. And you can see the coulisses. What's interesting about this house, it has another element that a lot of the French Canadian homes throughout Wisconsin, the western Great Lakes would have had, which is a collier, which is what's called a bell-cast eave. There's a slight curve at the end of the roof. And the purpose of this was to draw the water away from your foundation, from rain or melting snow. But you notice there is no coulisse in the corner. It's now dovetailed. And so as the years progress, elements start to disappear in some of the houses that continue to exist. But he has restored the interior as it should be. Everything is whitewashed. And we always see these French Canadian houses with their hewn logs exposed. They were never historically exposed at all. They were always covered. They were covered with horizontal clapboards or they were covered with board and batten or vertical siding. And sometimes in the early years, they would just put the bark on them. This was a French-Canadian house in Prairie du Chien that no longer exists, but it still had its original covering on it, and it still had its solid board and batten shutters. Didn't have storm windows. Shutters were good. This is another little French-Canadian house. Guillaume Saint-Germain-du-Gaultier came to Prairie du Chien from Green Bay. And this is the way the house looked in about 1900, with members of the family standing in front of it. It survived all of the floods of Prairie du Chien because it's on the main village island. And at one time, as Zebulon Pike said, there used to be 18 houses, French-Canadian houses, if not more, on the main village. This is the only one that is left. And there are no longer any coulees. This was built about 1835, 1840. And now we are down just to horizontals, pièce sur pièce, which means dovetailed. And this is why a lot of people think these are, log cabins, because, well, Daniel Boone and everybody else built log cabins with dovetails. It's interesting. Every ethnic group makes their dovetails differently. The French make it different from the Germans, who make it different from the Norwegians, who make it different from the Swedes, and so on. And so dovetailing can sometimes tell a story about a house. Also, a lot of these houses are built on 13-foot increments. Don't ask me why 13 feet. Okay. But and they're always wider than they are deep. And so there's various different ways of telling whether you're looking at French Canadian or somebody else. The logs tend to be very uniform in size. You don't have a great big one and then a small one. Again, they were all somewhat uniform in size. And this one still has Roman numerals on each of the four corners, because quite often the buildings were hewn where the wood stood, measured out, and then floated. At Prairie du Chien, there was no wood. You're a prairie, okay? And so you had to go up the Wisconsin River, or you had to go up the Mississippi River to the pineries in the Menominee River Valley, or you had to go over to Iowa to the Yellow River to find your logs. And you'll find that a lot of the houses are made out of maple, oak, or pine. And that can sort of tell you where they got their wood. This is made out of pine, so it probably came from the Menominee River Valley. In 1827, the Prairie du Chien area is surveyed, and they surveyed the prairie, but then they go up on the bluffs. And the surveyor describes the bluffs as a savanna with oak openings and sugar bushes. So you have your oak and you have your maple, and then you have your pine up north. And that's what you find. They're made from the woods that were available locally. This is the house undergoing restoration. As I said, it had one too many floods. What is difficult to see on a slide is that these logs are only hewn on two sides. On the side that's going to face the outside, and the side that's going to face the inside. And they are left unhewn. They're stripped of their bark, but they are left unhewn on the top and the bottom. The reason for that is that you could get a closer fit with two curved logs, and then you'd only have to do your chinking on the two sides. And so a lot of them are only hewn on two sides. And this had its original whitewash finish on it. This house is also in Portage. It's a revue house. And this one is completely different. It's a half-timbered house. It's on columbage. It's my house. So this is when the siding was taken off and I was getting it insulated. And this gives you a beautiful view of the construction. You have coulisses at each corner. You have heavy bearing beams. And then you have diagonal bracing. And then an extra bracing up to the peak to support the roof. So, what was the bousselage? Only a little bit of it remained, right up here, and it's all soft red brick. Brickyards were opened in 1829 with the construction of the second Fort Crawford. And I had to do some work in the front yard and remove some old steps, and underneath that there's a ton of broken soft red brick. Probably all fell out and throw it in there. But again, so you have very heavy half timbering filled with red brick, and this house still has its French casement windows on the second floor. It does not have the English double hung windows. It has French casement windows, which most of the early French houses had casement windows. So, we come to someplace you guys are familiar with. Francois Leroy's house, or the surgeon's quarters, you all call it. This is a picture of it before it was turned over. And this is the way you see it now. Is the restoration still going on?
I think they just finished.
They just finished, okay, so this is not quite finished. Photographs. So again, this house is somewhat of an anomaly, and I'm going to show you a couple other anomaly houses. Obviously, it was built by a French Canadian, and he used what you had here. This is tamarack. And tamarack is much smaller than pine or oak or maple. And I don't have a picture of the front of it. This is the back. The front looks like just one building, but then you have these two wings. And again, this is all somewhat of an anomaly. And it could be because he lived in part of it and used the rest of it as trading. But it also doesn't have straight pitched roofs. They're I don't know. And there are some other ones that still exist that I will show you. But again, you can see the tamarack logs. They were dovetailed. They're filling them in with more squared wood right now. And that is the weak point of any log house, are the corners. Because if your roof leaks, it's going to come to the corners and drip down. And if you're dovetailed, it rots your dovetails before the rest of the house. And this is a really nice picture of the second floor of the surgeon's quarters. And you can see the infill at the gable ends, which again is brick. This one is also in Portage, and it's we haven't figured this one out yet. It's one of 4 that used to exist. Ignore this. This house was used to sit at this level. After the '65 flood, the owner decided to move it above the flood. But it's a 2-story log house, which is very unusual to find in the French Canadian culture. And it's made of hewn logs that are set pièce sur pièce. They are dovetailed in the corner, but then in the corner is this freestanding coulisse that has then been pegged into the hewn logs. And at first we thought, well, they did that for support purposes. Well, since we found 3 other houses that were built like this, that's not why. And so we have not been able to figure out why this happens. And Louis Robard, who built the house, was originally from St. Louis. So is he bringing up a tradition with him? Well, then you have the Barrow house, which doesn't exist right now anymore. Again, it's pièce sur pièce. It's dovetailed in the corners. And at first I thought these were coulisses, but they aren't. Again, they are attached and pinned into the horizontals. And Monsieur Barreau came directly to Portage from Canada, from French Canada. So no one's been able to determine why, and this is really almost a 2-story house also.
Does that one still exist? Somewhere?
You want to know the story of that one?
Oh, maybe I should have asked.
You should have asked. It's not a nice story. It was donated to the Wisconsin Historical Society for Old World Wisconsin.
Oh,
Yeah, Old Years, right. So they disassembled it and took it there and let it lay on the ground for a number of years.
oh.
So it doesn't exist anymore. I work for the Wisconsin Historical Society. I like to tell stories about those. As Susan will tell you. So you could make one of these log structures with very simple tools. You could have a felling axe to cut down the trees, and then you could have a hewing axe to straddle that tree, and good hewers could walk a tree and hew from one side to the other, giving you 2 flat sides. Yeah, not lose your toe while you're at it, okay? So basically that's all you needed. And again, using your felling axe or your hewing axe, you could cut dovetails if you wanted, or you could have adzes and create that channel to slide your tenons. Didn't need much at all. This is an inventory of the Saint-Germain-Vigo house at Prairie du Chien, done in 1840. The little log house that still exists on the main village. And so you have 1 house and lot, you have 4 horses, 3 cows, 1 cart and wagon, 1 pleasure sleigh, 2 trains. Trains are the harness that you need to hitch your horse, right? 1 stable, logs for another house, harness, woman's saddle, 3 tables, 1 cherry bureau, 1 sideboard, 1 bedstead, 2 feather beds, 6 chairs, 2 chests, 1 double stove, 4 iron pots, 1 tea kettle, 1 pair of brass dog irons, 3 looking glasses, 2 candlesticks, and 1 clock. This is in a 2-room house. Furnishings of 1840. And I have read other probate estates. The houses were all very well furnished, and the archaeological remains show that they have blown glass, they have silver, they have china, some of which was even Chinese export porcelain imported from China to North America. So they are well furnished. The early ones were heated with fireplaces, but there was a forge in Quebec, Saint Maurice Forge, and they would make what are called 6-plate stoves. And then these stoves were also made in the Albany, Troy, New York area, and they were also made at Pittsburgh. And a lot of the later houses do not have fireplaces because they were heated with stoves. And again, in some of the inventories I've gone through, they'll enumerate a Montreal stove or a Pittsburgh stove. And that's what they were talking about. Remember, this all comes by water. No train ship. And you don't want to do it by horse. These are some pieces of furniture that are French Canadian, but made in Wisconsin. The rocking chair comes from Green Bay. The small side table comes from Prairie du Chien, descended in the Gagne family. The armoire is from Prairie du Chien, and it's written on the back, Jean-Marie Coelet, so we know who owned it. The pair of chairs were found along the Zumbro River in Minnesota, but the family that settled there originally came from Prairie du Chien, the Rock family. In a lot of the inventories, and including the one I just read, they talk about carriages and sleighs. These are the type of carriages you would have seen at the French Canadian settlements in what's now Wisconsin, the calèche, high-wheeled cart. Again, James Lockwood, who's a good Presbyterian, talks about the residents of Prairie du Chien, and he says on Sundays, all they do is race their horses and carriage up and down the prairie. That's a sleigh. They had sleighs for traveling. Again, there's some prints of in this area, and then this is a Red River cart that you find a lot going from the Red River down the Mississippi River. It's just hauled by oxen or something for work in the farm. Now, Americans start moving into this area as soon as the land is available. And the land becomes available as soon as the United States starts signing treaties with the native nations and acquiring their land. And when Americans are coming here, they're coming from basically New York and New England, first of all. And they're bringing with them the style of architecture that is popular out there, which by this time is Greek Revival. And it's interesting, the most early Greek Revival houses that you will find in Wisconsin were built by people of French Canadian heritage. So this was built by Charles Grignon, what, 1837, I think? Great French Canadian, or Greek Revival architecture, but he puts in a little French Canadian thing. You will find that, and again, I have one for Prairie du Chien, where a visitor talks about how they sit on their second floor porch and can look over the Mississippi River. So Charles brought that to his house. Augustin Grignon built this house in Butamore. It's always called the Grignon Hotel. I'm not too sure if that's what it started out to be. But again, it's a nice Greek Revival house. Center door, flanked by even number of windows, 5 windows across the top, single pitch roof, gable ends, and a great Greek Revival entryway. Prairie du Chien. I think we ought to rename this house.
Rename it?
Yeah, rename it.
Rename it after me.
Well, we ought to call it the Rolette House. This house was built in 1837 for Jane Fisher Rolette. She was married to Joseph Rolette, the main fur trader in the community, and their marriage sort of fell to pieces, and so she signed a separation agreement in which Joseph had to build her a 2-story house out of stone. So this was part of her separation agreement. And then when she married Hercules Dowse, when she passed it on to her cousin, Bernard Walter Boisbois, because he had been her trustee during the separation agreement. And then Joseph Rolette himself had to have a new house after he built one for his separated wife. And so he started the construction of this house in 1841. It never quite got completed, but again, it's an Ice Creek Revival house, and it would have had a second floor portico, such as the Charles Green house is. So, where can you go visit these structures? You can go to Heritage Hill, go across the river, or you can go to Prairie du Chien. Those are about the main ones that are open to the public. The rest of them are privately owned. And, you know, I focused on Wisconsin, but there are also French Canadian log houses in Michigan, in Iowa, and a lot in Minnesota. Any questions? Yes?
I'm curious, Canada is a large country,
Right.
and I can't imagine that they don't have fur there, so why did they come down to Wisconsin?
How do I say this? So when the French start engaging in the fur trade, which is in the 1600s, they have a settlement which Champlain starts, which we now call Quebec. And they wanted to engage in the fur trade. And the native nation that was around there was the Huron. And the Huron knew the native nations in the western Great Lakes. And so they would go visit the nations in the western Great Lakes and get the furs and then trade the furs to the French. So the Huron were middlemen. Why didn't they go farther north in Canada? Because the British were up there at Hudson's Bay. Okay, so the British were up at Hudson's Bay, and believe me, there was a line of demarcation. The French and the British tried not to go into each other's areas, and you really didn't need to because there were enough furs to go around. In time, the French don't want the middlemen anymore, and they start coming into what's now Wisconsin. And I don't know if you've heard of the Fox Wars in the 1730s. A lot of that had to do with the fact that the Meskwaki were the best middlemen. And the French and they were coming to the Dakota and the Ojibwa and, you know, Assiniboine and other nations to get the furs. And so the French wanted to get rid of the Meskwaki as the middlemen, and then, which they did. And so then the trading was directly between the French and then in time the British. But you have Hudson's Bay Company pretty much monopolizing the northern part of Canada.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how do these styles of building relate to kind of your colloquial style of building back in France?
Okay, the majority of people who settled in French-speaking Canada, in Quebec, come from Brittany and Normandy. And those houses are very much stone.
Okay.
But if you look at the stone houses in Brittany and Normandy, they look just like what you're going to see in the city of Quebec. The reason that went to wood is because when they are going out into the wilderness, it's a lot faster to, you know, cut down trees and hew them. But again, the architectural format, whether it's stone or whether it's wood, for the smaller houses is very, very, very the same. So yeah, we think of, you know, the French coming over. They were really just the people from Brittany and Normandy.
Okay.
Nowhere else.
Were there a lot of, in the long lots that are laid out, it seems like it wasn't super formally surveyed and things like that. Were there a lot of disputes among neighbors about where their property was or wasn't?
No, I mean, we've never come across that at either Prairie du Chien or Green Bay or down in the Illinois country. It was, you know, okay, I'm gonna, you know, take this much sort of thing. It's not until after the War of 1812 that the residents get twitchy. Because what had happened is that the Americans had come down into the Illinois country after the American Revolution, and George Rogers Clark, perfectly good example. There's lots of French-speaking people there, and he says, "Show me the deeds to your property." And well, they don't have deeds to their property, so they were losing their property, and that's some of the reason why some of the Illinois French came up to Prairie du Chien. So what happens in 1816 is that the residents of Prairie du Chien realize these Americans are coming and we don't have any deeds for our property. So they write a petition to Congress, asking Congress to give them a piece of paper that shows that they own their land. And so a surveyor comes to Mackinac Island, to Green Bay, and to Prairie du Chien, interviews everybody, and if you can prove that your piece of land has been continually inhabited for 20 years, they'll give you a patent. And so those first maps that I showed you of Green Bay and of Prairie du Chien are from when the surveyor came. There's also one for Mackinac Island. I just didn't show that. And so people testify and say, yeah, so-and-so lived on this property, and then so-and-so did, and then now I have it. Or if you testify for your neighbor, so-and-so has it. So there never seems to have been a lot of disagreement. There is a few deeds filed down in Illinois for land at Prairie du Chien, but where they're just saying, so-and-so sells his land in the village to so-and-so.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not until Americans come in.
We're a lot more we're very litigious. And
Yes,
have
we
things
are.
written down, and it's an interesting,
Yeah.
different philosophy, yeah.
A completely different philosophy, and I mean, a very good example is I showed you, the Brisbois house. So Jane wants to get separated from Joseph. She can't do anything, she's a woman. So she has to have her cousin, Bernard, file the papers of separation for her. And so this whole agreement is drawn up. She doesn't sign the agreement. Her cousin signs the agreement because he's a man, So you're under, American law is based on British law. And they have what they call the right of coverture. But as soon as a woman marries, she's covered by her husband. Where under French law, women could keep their maiden name. And we've got examples of that. They could own their own property. Under a British and American law, as soon as a woman married, if her father had given her anything, it now becomes her husband's. So under French law, women could maintain their maiden name, they could own property, and they could divorce their husbands. Even though they're Catholic, they can divorce their husbands. And again, we have examples of that up at Prairie du Chien, of women having rights when they were still operating under French law. And French law operated at Prairie du Chien into the 1830s. So Wisconsin Territory comes from.
I'm just curious, so I've always thought that 5/4 on the door was called federal. But you're saying Greek revival. Is it just two words for the same style, or is
Well, yeah, you could call it Georgian if you want to.
okay?
It's a style of architecture that begins in the 1700s, where you want a house with a center hall and a room on each side. And, it's contemporary people who have given these names to the form of architecture. So the center hall flanked by a room, and quite often a room behind that, started in the 1700s. We call it Georgian, and then once we become the United States, we call it federal. Okay, and then once you start adding these Greek entablatures over windows and doors, then we call it Greek revival. It's not until Downing and Jackson start drawing these books of new types of architecture that you get away from this center hall component, and you get Gothic and, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, in England, they're all Georgian.
I was gonna ask if there was any hope of having one at Old Grove, but, my second question is, the log structure on St. Burial Island in Portage.
Yeah.
You said it's open to the public. I'm curious when, and with the recent flooding,
Yeah,
apparently
that's-
it's survived many floods. Did it get its feet wet?
Yeah. So let me go back again. Yeah, the had, let me see, what? Well, let's do it this way. It had quite a bit of water in it. Where are we? Don't become old, you can't see. Okay. It had water in it this spring up to the windowsills. So it was open, the 2 previous summers. All of the floors had to be ripped up. Holes had to be poked into the foundation to get an airflow in. There is a center partition that has drywall on that, we have to take that off. So hopefully that's all going to be restored and it's going to be back open next spring. Mhm. Yeah, there were debates as to whether we should raise the house or not, but not going to do it.
Is there a website or like a Facebook page for that?
Not per se.
Not individually, okay.
And that's owned by the Wisconsin Historical Society?
No, it's owned by the British
Very shame.
Historical Society.
Love your museum, thank you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.